Alright, this is Mr. Gillum, and today we're going to be learning how to make a truth table for a conditional, or an if-then statement. So we did conjunctions and disjunctions and compound conjunction, disjunction, all that stuff yesterday and got familiar with it, but now today we're going to do truth tables and with if-then statements. So when I say conditional, remember what I'm talking about is an if-then statement. An if-then statement. So if P, then Q. All right, and we're going to approach it a lot like we did the conjunction and disjunction. So for every variable, we need a column, and as the variables increase, the number of columns doubles. So as you can see here, I labeled if P then Q is what our outcome will be. We have a variable P, a variable Q. We don't have any knots in there, nothing like that yet. So just a real simple, just basic truth table here. And I got an example for you. It says if you study 4 hours or more, so here's my P, you study 4 hours or more, then you will get a score of an A on the exam. The only guarantee in this if-then statement is that if you study 4 hours, if that is true, you will score an A on the exam. Okay, that's the only guarantee. However, it doesn't mean that you can't get an A without studying 4 hours. But we're going to talk about that in a second. So let's go ahead and start labeling our truth table here. We're going to go true, true, false, false, and then every other one, false, true, false. Now, here's where things are a little different than yesterday. Let's see here. What's a good color that you will be able to see well? Let's go with, sure, you'll be able to see yellow. Okay. If you study 4 hours and you get a score on the exam, that is a true statement. If you study for 4 hours but you don't get an A on the exam, then something has happened. Something is not right. That is false. The guarantee that your teacher made that said, if he said you'll study for 4 hours, you will score an A on the exam, he has reneged on that. I mean, he didn't follow up on his part of the bargain. That is false. However, if you didn't study for 4 hours or more, you could still get an A on the exam. So that could be true. Or if you didn't study 4 hours, you won't score an A on the exam. That could also be true. So what I want you to understand here is in the conditional, it's only false. The only time you're going to have a false in the if-then column is if your hypothesis is true, but your conclusion is false. That means somebody's guarantee did not hold up. All right. In this case, if you did study for 4 hours, but you didn't get an A on the exam, the professor lied to you or something didn't, their guarantee did not hold up. So this is the important part. If you get a true in your hypothesis and a false in your conclusion, your if-then statement is false. That's the only way to get a false. So it's going to be tricky to remember that because if-then statements are a little different than others where we had about the same amount of trues as falses, but in an if-then statement, you'll have usually one false and the rest being true. Let's see here. Okay, so now let's get into a little bit more complicated if-then statement. It says find the truth table for the inverse. Oh, okay, the inverse. We've talked about the inverse. It's when you negate the hypothesis and the conclusion. So I changed the statement here. It says if you don't study 4 hours or more, you will not score an A on the exam. So now my column's just a little different now. I do have P and Q still, but I also need to know what not P and not Q their truth values are. So for P, true, true, false, false. For Q, and we're alternating just so that we meet all of the different things that could possibly happen. My negation of P are just the opposite values. So if it says true, we're going with false. If it says false, we're going with true. Same way with the Q values. I'm looking at these columns right here and comparing them. If it says true in the Q, we're saying false in the not Q. All right, and so now I have these two things to compare. Let's see here. I'm comparing these two columns in my if-then statement, my conditional statement. And remember, there's only one way to get a false in an if-then statement. It's if my hypothesis is true, but my conclusion is false. That means something happened where somebody did not hold up their end of the bargain. So in this case, it says false, false. So now here's where things get a little confusing. If you don't not study, which meaning you do study, then you will get an A in the exam. Okay, so For now, it's going to be really confusing to double negative that, but you get the idea. False, false, that is true. That can happen. False, true, that's okay. True, false, this one right here. This is the part that is going to make our if-then statement false. And then true, true. That is true as well. Okay, so it goes back to what we were talking about before. As you add these inverses and double negatives and things like that, it's going to be more confusing. But a conditional is only false. So you only end up with a false in the last column if the hypothesis is true, but the conclusion is false. So it goes back to what we were talking about on that first page. So we had a true and then a false. Therefore, it was false. All other combinations will receive a true statement still. So let's find the truth table for the converse. Okay, so with the converse, what we do is we switch around the hypothesis and the conclusion, which we talked about. So now, okay, I rewrote the statement again. If you score an A in the exam, then you study more than 4 hours. So once again, we have a smaller truth table. We don't have any negations or nots, not Q or not P. And you'll notice that I didn't put them in alphabetical order, and there's a reason I didn't do that. It can be confusing if you put them in alphabetical order and then you're looking at the hypothesis backwards. So we're just going to go ahead and put our hypothesis first as our variable and our conclusion second as our variable in our chart, so that there's no confusion as far as looking at the truth values. So let's take a look here. We got true, true, false, false, true, false, true, false. Okay. So we've set up our variables, all the different combinations of things that could happen. We can do true, 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 false, false, true, false, false. 4 different unique things that could happen. Now, if Q, then P. All right, so yes, we switched it around, but let's read it now. It says, if you score an A on the exam, then you study more than 4 hours. Okay, that could be true. If you get an exam, if you get an A on the exam, then you study more than 4 hours. Then you didn't study more than 4 hours. False. False, true. False, false. Okay, the only way for it to be false is if it is a true and then a false. It would be a false statement. Okay? Finally, truth table for the contrapositive. So we switched around the hypotenuse and the conclusion, and then we negated both of them. I changed a little deal here. If you don't score an A on the exam, then you didn't study for more than 4 hours. Okay, so we have our 2 variables, their negations, and then finally our conclusion part where we want to make sure the truth value holds. So true, true, false, false, true, false, true, false, not Q. And the reason I have Q first is because it's part of our hypothesis now, our beginning, it's behind the if part of our if-then statement. Not Q is false, false, true, true, and then like I said, I'm just looking at these trues. And then if it's Q is true, then not Q is false. And not P. So P is true, not P is false, true, false, true, false, and then true. Okay, so now once again, I'm just looking at, and this should be not Q and not P for our hypothesis, or our final column that we're looking at here. And let's just take a look here. It says false, false. We know that could be true. False, true. That's okay. True, false. Once again, that is the only way to get a false statement. And then true, true would be true as well. So false, false. Okay, let's think about this. If it's a false that we did, okay. You don't score an A on the exam is false. That means you did score an A on the exam. Then you, instead of didn't, you say did study for more than 4 hours. Okay, so when you are looking at these statements, you have to double negate. Since we're doing the contrapositive, it's like a don't. If it's a false don't, then it would be really you did score an A. So sometimes the verbal usage of these can be confusing. But I will assure you, as long as you have any combination of trues and falses, it will be true, except the one exception. If your hypothesis is true, but your conclusion is false, then your if-then statement is a false truth value. Okay? So that is the big key right here, this little false. If you see a true false for your conditional, then that is the case. And this time we got 3 variables, throwing the 3 variables at you here right away. And since we've been practicing truth tables, I know we can do it. And as you can see, the number of columns we have has doubled since we have added another variable. So we're going to set this up kind of the same way we have yesterday. We got a P, a Q, and an R. We also need the negation of P. We need the conjunction Q and R. And then finally we need to look at the whole thing as a whole, which is right here in this last column. So let's start labeling our chart. I'm going to start with half trues, half falses. Then I'm going to go double, or just half as many trues, half as many falses. Going in 2s, then I'm going in 1s. And now I have 8 unique different things that could possibly happen. So that we should be good at. But now I have the not P, so I'm looking at the P's, and whatever P says, I'm doing the opposite of that. So if it said false, I went to true. Q and R. Now the only way Q and R, its conjunction, is true is if both Q and R are true. So in this case, Q and R, we got true, true right there. And we got a true, true here, true and true. And everything else, if there's a false involved, right there, right there, right there, there's all these falses. Those all those statements have to be false. All right, and so now to find my final solution, what I'm going to look at is my not P column. Let's see here, my not P column and my Q and R column. I'm looking at these 2 columns right here. And what I'm looking for is anything that says true and then false, I know is a false statement. So this says true and then false, that is false. This is true then false, so that is false. And this is true and then false. So that is false. So I got 3 falses. Any other combination for an if-then statement will work besides if the hypothesis is true and the conclusion is false. So even if it says false true, we're okay. False false, we're okay. False false, false false, true true. All that stuff's okay. But if the hypothesis says it is a true statement and the conclusion is a false statement, then you have lost your guarantee. And it goes back to what we were really concentrating on before. In the very first slide here, it says we want to, conditional is only false. The only way to make it false is if your hypothesis is true, but the conclusion is false. Step 1 more. Last but not least, we'll do a little disjunction here, a little OR statement. And once again, I have 3 variables, so I have P, Q, and R. And so I'm just going to go ahead and start filling out my table like we know how to do. And we're going to go by 2s. And then finally, every other one. Okay, Q, if Q, then R. We also need that. So as I'm looking through, I see a true false right here, so that must be false. I see a true false right here, that must be false. Those are the only 2, then I know the rest, no matter what they are, it will still give me a true truth value. And now I'm comparing P or Q then R. So I'm looking at this column and this guy. And because I know it's an OR statement, one or the other must just be true. So I see it true, 1, 2, 3, 4. I see 4 trues right off the bat. That tells me these all must be true. And then I see all falses over there, so I'm looking at these last 4. There's a true, there's a true, there's a true. True, true, true. That leaves just the 1 to be false, where we have a double false, and in an OR statement we have to have one of them be true for it to be true at the end. Alright, so we got a couple complex examples in there, and hopefully we're starting to catch on how these truth tables work. Today we learned about a conditional, so hopefully you know that in a conditional, the big idea, the whole point was to introduce you to the idea that